Since I'm only going to talk for a few minutes here, I won't really talk about what's the evidence. I think that's fairly straightforward that they are in fact manipulating the currency. Just to say that it is really unprecedented. There's never been anybody making capital flow uphill, taking a developing country and running surpluses on this scale. What I think I maybe can contribute to this discussion is I really want to talk a little bit about why your normal intuitions about what are the consequences of the Chinese surplus, what would be the consequences if they do something to reduce it, is wrong under current conditions. There are a lot of people who still talk about this issue as if it were 2005, as if we were in a normal economic environment, a normal environment in terms of monetary policy. We're not, and that makes a huge difference to how you ought to think about this issue. So if you were going back, middle of this past decade, there was an argument that whether or not you thought the Chinese were behaving improperly, the consequences for the United States and other advanced economies were, look, they were sending us cheap goods and cheap money, and that at least has
no interest in economics, and author of a very important textbook on economics. So, Paul, why don't you lead us off with about 5 to 7 minutes on your take on the China currency issue?
Okay, so let's see. Try. Since I'm only going to talk for a few minutes here, I won't really talk about what's the evidence. I think that's fairly straightforward that they are in fact manipulating the currency. Just to say that it is really unprecedented. There's never been anybody making capital flow uphill, taking a developing country and running surpluses on this scale. What I think I maybe can contribute to this discussion is I really want to talk a little bit about why your normal intuitions about what are the consequences of the Chinese surplus, what would be the consequences if they do something to reduce it, is wrong under current conditions. There are a lot of people who still talk about this issue as if it were 2005, as if we were in a normal economic environment, a normal environment in terms of monetary policy. We're not, and that makes a huge difference to how you ought to think about this issue. So if you were going back, middle of this past decade, there was an argument that whether or not you thought the Chinese were behaving improperly, the consequences for the United States and other advanced economies were, look, they were sending us cheap goods and cheap money, and that at least had some upside. Difficult for import competing industries, but good for other things. The old joke at the time, that we had fair and balanced trade, the Chinese sending us poison toys and tainted seafood, and us sending them fraudulent securities. But the point now is that we are not now in a world in which capital inflows from China lead to lower interest rates. And even aside from the fact that when they did lead to lower interest rates, what we did with that inflow of capital was needless to say, not a good thing. But at this point, we're not even in that world. We are in a world where all of the advanced economies are in a liquidity trap, where interest rates are up against the zero lower bound, where short-term interest rates cannot go down. Long-term interest rates are not zero because people do expect this will end at some day. But essentially, we have a world that is awash in excess saving, a world that has too much money, more saving than people are willing to invest. That's a world in which no good comes to us out of surpluses for whatever reason from China. It's a world in which, on the contrary, it's a world in which mercantilism actually turns out to be true, in which Chinese surpluses do come at the expense of jobs and employment elsewhere in the world. That's a hard point to get across. When I talk to people, they keep on saying, well, if the Chinese were to not buy as many of our treasuries, wouldn't interest rates spike? The answer is no, they would not. Short-term interest rates certainly would not spike, because at the moment we're in a world where Taylor rule says that the Fed funds rate should be, depending on which rule you use, something like minus 5%. We're not in a world in which short-term interest rates would rise. Sometimes people say, well, but that's short term. What about long term? What if the Chinese were to shift out of long-term assets? There are a lot of reasons to think that doesn't matter, but one point that I haven't seen emphasized is that they've already done that. Over the last year and a half, China has been shifting from long-term to short-term U.S. treasuries with no discernible impact. So this is not something you need to worry about. What the Chinese actually would be doing if they were to stop doing so much intervention is, and I don't know why this point is so hard to get across, but what they would be doing is, in effect, they would be doing quantitative easing on our behalf. Right? We have a situation right now where the Fed is engaging in purchases of non-standard assets, which are sterilized. They're basically borrowing short-term and lending long-term. But in any case, they're buying non-standard assets in an attempt to stimulate the economy. One of the things you could do, in principle, one of the assets you can buy is foreign currency. You can buy foreign assets. That is a form of quantitative easing. The United States cannot do that because it would be viewed as a predatory beggar-thy-neighbor policy. But if the Chinese were to decide to shift out of dollar assets, that would actually be doing QE on our behalf. Let me offer you a parallel, a story people don't talk about that much, but really should. One of the success stories of monetary management in this crisis has been Israel. Israel has managed to avoid a severe economic shock largely through purchases of foreign exchange to keep the shekel weak. What they bought was, in fact, about $30 billion worth of foreign exchange. Scaled up by the size of their economy, that would be the equivalent of $2 trillion for us. So in effect, Israel has fought the recession by doing exactly what would happen if the Chinese were to dump their entire foreign exchange reserves. Not saying that that's what we expect to happen, what we want to happen, but it's just a way of saying that we should not be afraid of what the Chinese might do if we pressure them to stop this currency manipulation. Last point, and I think Fred will probably have some versions of this. How do we think about what are the consequences of what's going on? How do we think about the costs to all of us of this artificially depressed renminbi? The wrong thing is to say, well, let's try and feed into our model what would happen if the Chinese currency appreciated by X percent. Because you have to think about this in terms of all of the knock-on effects. There would be changes in the value of other currencies. The right way to think about it, I would argue, is that we have an artificial surplus which, because of the way the world is right now, is falling on the output and employment of all of the countries that currently have monetary policy which has reached its limits. All the countries that are in liquidity trap, up against the zero lower bound, which is basically the advanced countries, United States, Europe, and Japan. And a reasonable guess is that if China were to stop running these artificial surpluses, that would be a net export shock in a favorable direction to all of these countries in roughly equal shares. China's surplus is on the order of 1% of the combined GDP of the liquidity trap countries. If it were to stop running these surpluses, that would be the equivalent of 1% of GDP positive shock. It would be the equivalent of 1% on the multiplier. Or to put it the other way around, the depressing effect on our economy and also Europe and Japan is whatever the multiplier is on a 1% of GDP export shock, which is probably, consensus estimate would be around 1.5. GDP is probably around 1.5% lower than it would otherwise be. Employment, given the usual rule of thumb, around 1.5 million less. This is not huge. It's not that all of our problems would go away if we didn't have the undervalued renminbi, but it's significant. It's a fairly significant part of the problem. If we can get some change in Chinese currency policy, it would help the world.
One of the arguments that's put out there against doing something is the knock-on consequence to the Chinese economy that we can't control. And could we set off a series of problems inside the Chinese economy that we'd all come to rue afterwards?
Yeah, I think that against stupidity, the gods themselves contend in vain. If the Chinese do something, but look, it actually is true that from China's own point of view, from the point of view of their national welfare, an appreciation of the renminbi is actually the right thing to do. think about what was yesterday's business headlines, with China facing inflationary pressures and talking about the need to slam the brakes on domestic expansion and credit. That's crazy, right? Do your textbook analysis, and what it says is this is a clear indication that they've got an undervalued currency, and what they ought to be doing is appreciating it. So now, if they're going to do something really stupid, that might be a problem. The other thing one might want to say is that if we're worried that there could be something like some people blame the Japanese bubble economy on the Plaza Accord, which I've never believed, but in any case, at this point, the Chinese have managed to generate their bubble without ahead of the currency changes. So that's already a sunk cost. Yeah, and I mean, I just want to say, why are we talking about this differently now? Has there been some fundamental change in doctrine? And the answer is no. People have talked about the possibility of exchange rate protection back to the original GATT Accords. I mean, this is nothing new. What is new is two things: the scale of it. There has never been anything like what is happening now with China. Never has there been as drastic a misalignment. Never has there been intervention on this scale to keep a currency undervalued. And the second is the state of the world. We are experiencing depression-type economic conditions with zero interest rates, where shortage of demand, inability, loss of traction by monetary policy is at the core of our problems. This is a world in which these issues, which have been theoretically batted around for generations, now become acute, real-world concerns. I'm hearing Fred say this, which is, Fred's a big internationalist, and so am I. But, I mean, we are at the stage where we have to be talking about treating this as if it were a countervailing duty case, as if it's as if the Chinese were subsidizing their exports to the tune of 25, 30%. And if there is no ability to get anything without bringing out the baseball bat, then you do talk about temporary across-the-board tariffs on imports from China. It is, there comes a point when you have to say, without a credible threat, we're not going to get anywhere in negotiations. So that's where it is. I don't like it, but I think that realistically, the chance that it will trigger a trade war is very small, and it's hard to see any alternative.